In this video, we will discuss the ablative absolute. As you'll see, the ablative absolute is a special way to use participles in Latin. And, as you can tell from the name, it will use the ablative case. So first, let's briefly review both the forms of participles and the uses of the ablative case. First, the present active participle. There are two examples here. From the first conjugation verb voco vocare, we have vocans vocantes. From the third conjugation verb dico dicere, we have dicanes dicentis. We translate these with the formula blanking, so calling and speaking. You can recognize it by the ns on the nominative singular, or the nt before the adjective ending. The action of the present active participle is going on at the same time as the action of the main verb. Now, the perfect passive participle. Two examples are vocatus vocata vocatum and dictus dicta dictum. These translate as having been called and having been spoken. The perfect passive participle is a first and second declension adjective formed by adding us a to the stem of the fourth principal part. And the perfect participle denotes an action that is earlier than the action of the main verb. And the future active participle. Our two examples are vocaturus, vocatura, vocaturum, and dicturus, dictura, dicturum. These translate as about to call and about to speak. The future active participle is a first and second declension adjective formed by adding urus, ura, urum to the stem of the fourth principal part. And the future active participle denotes an action that is later than the action of the main verb. Okay, the ablative case has a broad range of functions, and one characteristic that runs throughout is the idea of circumstance. Let's look at three brief examples. Timore milites discedunt. The soldiers leave because of fear. Here, the word timore is in the ablative case to show the reason behind the soldier's action, and we call this function the ablative of cause. Second example, magno periculo milites pugnant. The soldiers fight at great cost. Here the words magno periculo are in the ablative case, and we call this the ablative of manner. And third example, illo tempora milites surrexerunt. At that time, the soldiers awoke. Here the words illo tempora are in the ablative case to give information about the time that the soldiers awoke. And we call this function the ablative of time when. We might think of these three examples of the ablative case as describing the circumstances surrounding the action of the sentence. The cause of the action, the manner of the action, and the time of the action. It is this idea of circumstance that will be used by the ablative absolute. Let's now look at a couple of examples of the ablative absolute. His verbis dictis, consul discessit. We can identify discessit as the main verb in the sentence and consul as the nominative subject. The phrase his verbis dictis is in the ablative case. You can notice that dictis is a perfect passive participle, and we'll translate it super literally as having been spoken. And so we'll start with a very literal translation. With these words having been spoken, sounds very ablative using the word with, the consul departed. Okay, this makes sense in English. We can understand from our translation that some words were spoken and then the consul left. But keep in mind that the ablative case is often used to describe the circumstances of an action, as it is here in this sentence. And you can probably think of some ways that English has to express this idea of circumstance. The best way is to turn the phrase, with these words having been spoken, into a clause with a subordinating conjunction. So here are two possibilities for our revised translation. When these words had been spoken, or after these words had been spoken, the consul departed. Remember that the perfect passive participle denotes an action that took place earlier than the action of the main verb. And so when we write these revised translations, it's clear that the words were spoken before the consul departed. So let's consolidate this information about the ablative absolute. You can identify the ablative absolute by finding two words that are in the ablative case. It is helpful to know that very frequently one of these words is a participle. The standard translation of the ablative absolute is with the noun participle. As we just saw a moment ago, we translated with these words having been spoken. That's the noun and the participle. But this translation is just an intermediary step, and you'll need to revise it before finalizing your translation of the sentence. You should consider the context of the sentence and ask yourself what sense the phrase is trying to construe. Here are some helpful subordinating conjunctions that you might use when you're revising your translation of the ablative absolute. To translate an ablative absolute that shows time, you might use when, while, as, or after. To show causality, you might use since or because. To show a condition, you might say if. And to express an adversative or concessive idea, you might say although. You might be able to think of some other conjunctions to use, but this list should help you get started. Okay, the best way to understand the ablative absolute is to really think about several examples. So, let's dive back in. Duce milites vocante, hostes fugiunt. Okay, our main verb is fugiunt, and hostes is our nominative subject. We can separate off the phrase duce milites vocante and recognize that duce is in the ablative case, and so is vocante. This is going to be our ablative absolute. Notice how we have a two-word phrase in which the words are in the ablative case. Vocante is a present active participle. We also have in there milites, an accusative direct object of the participle vocante. Okay, now recall that literal translation formula with the noun participle. So let's start there. With the leader, noun, calling, participle, the soldiers, direct object. The enemy flees. Okay, again, that makes enough sense, but English can better express the sense of this phrase by turning it into a clause with a conjunction. So here are some revised translations. While the leader is calling the soldiers, or since the leader is calling the soldiers, the enemy flees. Remember that the present active participle expresses an action that goes on at the same time as the action of the main verb. In our two revised translations, it's clear that the leader calling the soldiers and the enemy fleeing both happen at the same time. And then, to decide between these two revised translations, you'll have to consider the context of this sentence to determine precisely what sense the ablative absolute is trying to construe. Okay, let's try another sentence. Illo regente, bonam fortunam habebamus. We can recognize habebamus as our main verb, with we as the subject. Bonam fortunam as a direct object of that verb. And illo regente, watch out, two words in the ablative case. One of them is a participle. This is going to be our ablative absolute. Regente, the participle, is a present active participle, ruling. So let's go ahead for a literal translation with the noun participle. We'll have, with that man ruling, we will have good fortune. Okay, that makes enough sense, but English can construe it more precisely. So let's revise our translation. Remember that the present active participle denotes an action that goes on at the same time as the action of the main verb. Our main verb is in the future tense, so the act of ruling will also take place in the future. So when that man rules, we will have good fortune. With the idea being that when that man rules in the future, we will have good fortune at that time in the future. We can also state this conditionally. If that man rules, or if that man in the future will rule, we will have good fortune. Okay, let's finish this off with a quotation from Latin literature. Nicomede rege interfecto, equus eus inedia vitam expulit. So we can mark our subject in the nominative case and the main verb, expulit. Literally, his horse, vitam expulit, expelled his life, that's passed away. Inedia, This is an ablative of cause. We can say because of starvation. But at the beginning of the sentence, we have three words in a row in the ablative case. And one of them, interfecto, is a perfect passive participle. So we can mark this as an ablative absolute. So our literal translation with the noun participle would be with the king Nicomedes having been killed. And we can put this into English as after the king Nicomedes had been killed. We learned that his horse, out of loyalty, passed away because he starved himself.